Abigail Carter stood at the doorway of her ranch house, the wind biting through her woolen shawl as though it were made of paper. The Montana valleys stretched before her, wide and merciless, every ridge painted with the harsh colors of late autumn. The land looked beautiful from a distance, golden fields, the dark green line of pines against the horizon, snow already dusting the mountain peaks, but up close it was a battlefield. Every day was a fight for survival, every dawn another reminder that she bore the weight of the Carter Ranch alone. 2 years had passed since her husband was buried under the cottonwood tree by the river. She had not spoken his name aloud since the funeral, though she thought it almost daily when her body ached from labor or when her heart weakened under the strain of silence at night. To the town, she was a woman of iron, unyielding, unbreakable, the widow who refused charity and carried herself like a soldier. But to herself, she was just a woman with 3 children and no time to grieve. The youngest, Sarah, clung to her skirts that morning, whispering that her brother Henry's cough had grown worse in the night. Abigail had heard it herself, the wet rasp that tore through his small chest, the way his fever had boiled through his sheets until they were damp. The town doctor had come once, shaking his head as though already preparing her for the inevitable. He left behind a small pouch of herbs that seemed to do little more than mask the symptoms. Stronger medicines on the way, he had promised, but the supply wagon's been delayed. Outlaws, storms, who knows? Abigail had pressed her lips together, thanked him, and shut the door before he could see the fear pooling in her eyes. She had faced blizzards, wildfires, and cattle raids, but nothing terrified her like the sight of her child fading before her eyes. Rumors had a way of seeping into a person's mind, no matter how hard they tried to ignore them. In the Mercantile, she had overheard the ranch hands muttering about the mountain man, the recluse who lived above the tree line, a man said to know the secrets of the land better than anyone. Some said he had been a soldier broken by the war, others swore he had killed men and hid from the law. Children dared one another to run up the trail toward his cabin, though none ever made it far. Abigail had dismissed such talk before, chalking it up to idle storytelling meant to pass the time. But now, with Henry's fever climbing, she found herself clinging to those rumors like a drowning woman to driftwood. That morning, she saddled the mule with shaking hands, bundled Henry in a blanket, and laid him carefully across the small wooden cart. His skin was slick with sweat, his lips pale, and every few minutes a cough racked his small body. Abigail's heart ached at the sound, but she forced herself not to falter. Sarah cried at her side, asking if Henry was going to die, and Abigail bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood rather than let the tears fall. "He's going to be fine," she whispered, though the words felt brittle, like glass that could shatter with the next breath. The trail up the mountain was cruel. Stones slipped beneath the mule's hooves, and frost clung to every shaded rock, making the climb treacherous. Abigail kept one hand tight on the cart and the other gripping the reins, her knuckles raw from the cold. Each gust of wind cut into her like a knife, tearing through the shawl, clawing at her resolve. Twice she considered turning back, but then she would hear Henry's shallow wheeze, see the way his chest struggled for air, and press on. The mountain seemed endless, rising higher and higher, as though it wanted to test her will before revealing its secrets. By midday, her legs burned from the climb, and her lips were cracked with thirst. The sky had darkened with gray clouds, threatening snow. She whispered silent prayers with each step, prayers she had not spoken since her husband's death. "Please, Lord, don't take him too. Please just give me one more chance." And then, through the trees, she saw it, a thin line of smoke curling skyward, grey against the darker sky. Her breath caught in her throat, relief and fear clashing inside her. She urged the mule forward, her heart hammering as she followed the faint trail of smoke deeper into the pines. The cabin appeared almost suddenly, as though it had risen from the earth itself. Built of thick logs, its roof patched with bark and moss, it looked like it had weathered 100 storms without bending. Antlers hung above the door, and stacks of firewood stood neatly piled against the walls. The place seemed both wild and orderly, like a man had carved out his own corner of the wilderness and dared the world to touch it. Abigail halted at the edge of the clearing, clutching the reins tight. For a moment, doubt screamed inside her. What if the stories were true? What if the man inside was dangerous, or worse, unwilling to help? But then Henry coughed again, a sound so fragile it cut through her hesitation like a blade. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped forward. The door creaked open before she could knock. A man emerged onto the porch, tall and broad-shouldered, his beard thick and unkempt, his hair falling around his face like a curtain. His eyes were sharp, grey as storm clouds, and for a long moment he simply stared at her, silent and unreadable. Abigail's breath caught, but she refused to lower her gaze. She had faced death before. She would not cower now. "My boy," she said, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the clearing. "He's burning with fever. They told me you know medicine, please. I'm begging you." For several heartbeats the man said nothing. His face was carved of stone, his eyes flicking from her to the cart where Henry lay. Abigail felt her knees weaken, fear clawing at her chest. Then in a voice rough as gravel he spoke. "Bring him in." Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke, earth and dried herbs. Bundles of plants hung from the rafters. Jars filled with strange powders and roots lined the shelves. The man moved with a quiet efficiency, lifting Henry from the cart and laying him on a bed by the fire. Abigail stood stiffly, her hands clenched at her sides, watching as he checked the boy's breathing, touched his forehead, and muttered under his breath. He crushed herbs with a stone mortar, boiled water in a blackened pot, and mixed a brew that filled the air with a bitter scent. Abigail wanted to ask his name, wanted to ask what he was giving her son, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could do was watch and pray. The man pressed a cloth to Henry's brow, tipped the brew to his lips, and finally glanced up at her. His eyes softened, if only by a fraction. "He'll need rest, and more of this tea. Fever's strong, but it can break." His voice was low, measured, like a man unused to speaking, but careful with every word he chose. Relief surged through Abigail, nearly buckling her legs. She sank into a wooden chair, burying her face in her hands. For the first time in days, the crushing weight on her chest eased, if only slightly. She did not know who this man truly was, or why he lived alone in the wilderness, but in that moment, none of it mattered. He was hope she had been too afraid to admit she needed. Abigail returned to the ranch with Henry bundled in the cart, his breathing steadier, his fever cooled by the herbs Elijah had given. The mule clopped slowly down the trail, and every sound of the wheels against the rocks felt like a hymn of relief. She had not believed in miracles for a long time, but watching her son stir, hearing him whisper her name weakly, as though he had been pulled back from a cliff's edge, she allowed herself a breath she had been holding for days. When they reached home, Sarah ran out to meet them, clapping her little hands and crying with joy at the sight of her brother awake. Abigail gathered all three of her children to her chest that night, holding them close in the small lamplight of their cabin, and whispered promises she had no certainty she could keep, that she would never let them face harm again, that she would always find a way. Life settled back into the rhythm of the ranch, though it was never truly gentle. Cattle had to be moved to higher pastures, fences mended, firewood split and stacked before the snow sealed the land in its grip. Abigail worked from dawn until the stars shimmered above the ridge, her hands cracked and raw, her shoulders aching with the strain. Yet even as she bent to her endless chores, she found her thoughts straying back to the cabin, high on the mountain. Elijah Boone. She rolled the name in her mind like a stone in her palm. He had spoken it to her only once, but it lingered, heavy and steady. She had seen the way he lived, alone, surrounded by silence and smoke, with nothing but the wild for company. It frightened her, and yet it drew her. Excuses began to form. She told herself she must learn more about the herbs in case Henry's fever returned. She told herself she needed to know how to find plants that could ease her daughter's cough or help her sleep. She told herself it was duty, nothing more. And so she found herself on the mountain trail again, sometimes with her children in tow, sometimes alone with a basket on her arm. Each visit began awkwardly, with Elijah standing in the doorway as though unsure whether to send her away or let her in. But slowly, as the days shortened and the snows crept closer, the visits became less a burden and more a quiet understanding.